managing editor of Bloomberg Asia Opinion Team, coming to you from Tokyo. With me is Teela Reid, a proud Wiradjuri and Wallowan woman, a lawyer, a storyteller, and co-founder of the fabulous Instagram feed Blackfella Book Club, who is joining us from Gadigal land. Welcome, Teela. Good to have you with us.
Yeah, Yama. Look, I'm on the beautiful waters of the Gadigal people, also known as Sydney. And look, it's really good to be here and have this important conversation.
Thank you. So we're here to talk about the First Nations voice to the Australian Parliament. It's just days out from one of the most important votes that Australians will ever cast, and one that will set the tone for how the nation is viewed on the global stage. At its essence, the voice to Parliament is this. It's a mechanism that aims to guarantee a representative voice for First Nations people to advise the government on policies affecting Indigenous communities. So let's bring you in here, Teela. You've played a key role in talking to First Nations communities across the nation about the voice. Can you tell us a little bit about where you've been and what you've been hearing?
Look, I have had the privilege of traversing the continent to everyday Australians on the ground in community about this moment in history, really. My role as a lawyer really related to one kind of narrow part in relation to the Uluru Heart, and the Uluru Statement from the Heart was an invitation to the people of Australia to walk with us on this journey for change, really, for voice, treaty and truth-telling. In Australia is a nation. It was 01 as a federation without formal of Indigenous peoples. And so Australians are asked to rectify this omission of Aboriginal and Torres Nations founding document. And on the ground, look, I have found that Australians really care deeply on the ground about this issue, understand, on a broad level that things have to change. The life expectancy, educational gaps and Indigenous peoples and the general population is vast. And so, it's interesting because people can as a lawyer and go, oh, she's made it. But in fact, actually, the history is very real for us here. My maternal line and my paternal line of were both forced onto missionaries. And that makes me the first generation of my kinship, of my family, to have the chance to go to formal education, to get a degree. History is very real and very raw to us, and this unfinished business of our nation, the formal recognition, it boils down to is Australia prepared to recognise that its history didn't start in 1901? In fact, a deep of the First Nation this place.
And so in the conversations that you've been having with people, I understand you've been both talking to Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. Apart from the support that you've talked about, what are the main questions that they're asking you about the voice, and how do you answer those questions in a way that helps them explain what this process is and how important it is?
Look, I feel like there is a difference between the community conversations as opposed to the mainstream media conversations that we're seeing. We haven't had a referendum process in over we've kind of got the double challenge of not only explaining to Australians the proposal and the importance of the moment as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people by enshrining a voice to Parliament. We've also got the additional challenge that Australians are very unfamiliar with the purpose of a referendum process. So lots of questions have been raised in particular about, well, why a referendum? Why can't we just legislate the voice? Understanding of its complex relationship and deep history here with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. It's one explaining the story and First Nations people's relationship and the fact that we occupied the land since time immemorial. We are the oldest surviving cultures on the planet, and as a formally recognized that deep relationship. Australians are also, I think, with the heat of the debate, particularly since the beginning of the year around Prime Minister Anthony Albanese announced the referendum Parliament formally, there has been an active campaign by the opposition and, Peter Dutton, the leader of the opposition, who taken a stance against the referendum process and against enshrining the, which has been, I think, a deep disservice to our community. Politicians elected to act in the interest of our nation, and they've led a campaign on information and disinformation, and that's their strategy, is to confuse the people of Australia. And so when we have something like, to pass a referendum in Australia, double majority. So a majority of the states in Australia, a majority of the total population. So it's one of the hardest democratic tasks in the world. And it indeed will be, without bipartisan support in terms of conveying the message to Australia, why this moment is so important. And it's interesting because the conversations we're having as a nation are so by the politics, but when you talk to people outside who actually kind of have a very much an appreciation the place of Indigenous peoples here, and it's like, well, why hasn't Australia done? And I think that really reflects this, we have a very much an active denial. It's a bit of a get over it attitude and carry on and tie you. And so I think that campaign by the coalition, the opposition, and the no campaign has been deeply disturbing, because now, we're only days and hours out of casting this referendum vote, and some Australians confused by the moment as a result of the no campaign. And so, there really is, I think, many different sides to this conversation. The media are really only capturing kind of the hard yes case and the hard no case. Most Australians that I've spoke to are kind of somewhere in the middle. They're like, look, I really care about this. Things need to change, but I'm also raising questions about when I think about this moment, and if people draw their attention back to the Uluru Statement from the Heart, where I played a role as a lawyer in that movement. Australia was founded with racism and power in its constitution, and many histories past, Aboriginal people have called for change. So not just the Uluru. Many petitions in the past, the Akala Bark petitions, the Barunga Statement, the Larrakia petition, have all asked politicians to go and better decision making in the decisions that are. And so, there is a long legacy of calling for recognition that we were here first, and we ought to have a fair go in making decisions that affect our communities. And so, it's kind of been a bit about the way the national debate has heated up. Now we find ourselves in a position where it's so difficult for the everyday citizen to distinguish at the moment, and everyone is talking about everything but the question, and the question is simply in support a proposed law to recognise people by establishing a voice to Parliament. And so this very simple question has now been confused, misinformation about anything but the question.
So you've published a column with Bloomberg yesterday where you discussed this idea that in these dying days of the campaign, it's down to this kind of almost battle between the yes vote saying, this is about love. This is about, welcoming First Nations people into the Constitution with love and hope and looking for a way forward. Whereas the hard no vote is presenting this as a war, as something that will divide the nation unnecessarily and result in even further disadvantage. So how do you see the love and war debate being framed in as we go into the last few days of the referendum?
That debate between, this idea that the Yes campaign is saying this is an act of love to vote yes, and the No case saying this is a symbolic declaration in Australia, it leaves the nation in such a difficult, I think, space where you have these polarizing arguments. And I think it's a risk to our democracy that so many lies have been able to be spread. For example, the idea of the voice came from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. That is an invitation for peace on our country, a declaration of war and division. And I just think, when we have the spread of information on social media and mainstream media taking up the, I think, combative statements, leaves Australians really undecided. So we have 28% of Australians still haven't decided what they might vote today. The poll really could swing either way. We know that since kind of the politicians came into the debate as of the beginning of the year, polling has slowly climbed, but that's not really capturing some of what we're all experiencing on the ground, which is a number of Indigenous leaders in their communities have really switched from being kind of a hard no as a result of the confusion to a hard yes, going, this is a pragmatic step forward for our nation, and the consequences of a no vote has the danger of giving license to ongoing racism that we are experiencing. And so it's very tense times for us as a nation. I still feel very hopeful that goodwill that I'm seeing across the country, show at on the weekend, and we, we're days out from a very uncertain and trying to, at the moment as well, the nation's leadership hasn't really expressed, well, what happens on the other side when we wake up on October 15. There is, it's almost like there is an uncertainty around either way, whether that's yes or whether that's no. What do we do? But we're definitely seeing a groundswell of it. Make up only 3% of the total population, so around 800,000 people altogether, and a very small group of that really kind of boils down to those of us who can. Most of Aboriginal and Torres Strait the age of 40, we have a very young population. And so what we're seeing though is a real groundswell of people going, okay, this is a chance to reset this relationship that has really deteriorated in relation to reconciliation. I think it leaves over where do we go as a nation when it comes to continuing to reconcile this. Lots of people said, this might be the end of reconciliation if it is a no vote, because the nation has denied its and the rightful place of Aboriginal and Torres Strait peoples. Like, it is a fear. And if Australia says no to that, I think it leaves us in an uncertain position of how to move forward when it comes to reconciliation. perhaps that leaves us left in an era of reckoning and uncertainty and figuring out a different strategy forward. Either way, we all wake up and we have to live on this and continue to build and repair relationships. And for me, I look at the young people in our kinship who you've got young people going, why haven't we already got this work done? Like, why are adults now arguing about this? Like, can we all just vote yes? People, and we've got old people in our kinships and elders who are heartened by the state of the debate, because you have to remember, in Australia, we have Indigenous peoples who have survived the stolen generation removal of our children from their families, from their mothers and fathers' arms. We have elders in our community who have dispossession and displacement of them off their traditional lands. We have outcomes in the world. You know, our infant mortality, our life expectancy is almost a decade younger than other Australians. And so seeing the ongoing impacts of colonisation. And I think because the great majority of Australians live very wealthy and privileged, it can be very difficult for them to put themselves in a position and empathise with the First Nations deep disadvantage. Like that our disadvantage is just status quo, and it's unfortunately at the moment seems to be acceptable in a country that is so privileged and wealthy and built, I think, you know, off the backs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait. So yeah, that's kind of the kind of differences from young people and what we're hearing from older Australians. And this idea of a voice is a very and practical solution to some of the issues that our nation is facing. Example, health outcomes. What we're the evidence says if you listen to people about their local, then that, you know, enables decision makers to make better laws and policies. And so we've had previous referendum. 1967 in Australia, only 8 of 4 referendums have passed in our nation's history. One of the most successful referendum in Australian history was in 19. And that's kind of where my expertise in this process came in as a lawyer, which was fundamentally in that referendum, Australians voted yes by a great majority, 90.77% of us yes in 67, for federal parliament to have the power to make laws in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Prior to that, only the states had that power. And the states and colonies were effectively legislating discriminatory laws. So laws that massacre Aboriginal people, that would lawfully dispossess us from our lands. And so a unifying opportunity to go, well, perhaps if, you know, the federal parliament, who has now retained all of this power post 1900, we can get better decisions. But one thing 67 didn't say was that where you had the power to make laws in relation to Aboriginal, they should have a voice in those laws. So in 2020, very practical step. It's a practical step to go, okay, we achieved this in 1967. Then as a kind of step in making better laws and policies, then we should listen to the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are affected by these laws. Post 1967, we've seen kind of this, you know, lots of people around the world might have known about the Northern Territory intervention, this effective policy that was rolled out, the military in parts of Australia disproportionately affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And yeah, so the High Court has said, although federal parliament retained the power in 1960, it said those laws can be made not only for the benefit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but to the detriment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So race is very much a founding idea of Australia. Racism is a systemic issue in Australia, and this is just a real chance to go, how do we create a mechanism where as a nation we can provide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have input to improve the democratic process, to support decision makers in their decisions about our communities, and therefore these outcomes where we are actually continuing this reconciliation movement and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So it is very concerning that at the moment there is a movement by the opposition to, well, we don't want a voice for Aboriginal. We have to listen because we have, we think that we're better placed to make these decisions. And I think that the fact that with the coalition in Australia, we have been in power for almost the last decade. And in fact, under the opposition's leadership, the outcomes people got much. The gap was not closing. And First Nations self-determination for the opposition to saying that they are better placed to make decisions when in fact they have proven the outcomes get worse under a coalition government.
Yeah.
And when you think about no cases, they're not.
Could I just jump in here for a second, Teela? Thank you. Like the voice to Parliament, the Uluru Statement from the Heart, the previous attempts that you've mentioned to get, successive governments to listen to First Nations people and what First Nations people need to thrive in their communities. This doesn't come from nowhere. New Zealand has a treaty with its Indigenous people, the Maori, and has had for a very long time. Finland has a treaty and a version of a voice to Parliament for its Sami Indigenous community. Canada also has entered into a form of treaty with its Indigenous people, and they are also mentioned in its constitution. So when you say, when you talk to people around the world about this, and they cannot believe that Australia has yet to achieve this for its First Nations people, how much strength do you take and how much expertise do you draw on from these other Indigenous communities across the globe who have their own voice to Parliament and their own treaty, their own representation in the constitution of the nations where their land is based?
Yeah, that's a great point when you look globally at the fact that democracies like Australia have formulated structures where they engage appropriately with the Indigenous peoples of that land. And I've had the privilege of living on Turtle Island in Canada and studied there and travelled, to New Zealand or Aotearoa and places in parts of Europe. And I think it's very, and those are opportunities where you kind of look back and reflect on what is happening in this country. And I think you can only really kind of go to the very beginnings of Australia, which was formed as a penal colony. Captain Cook was the invader and ordered actually to consent of natives. This is in the diaries of discoverers, and to do that. And I think we're honestly big dilemma gaping in the heart of our nation as a result of this historical omission and failure to recognize the fact that there are and were people here on this land. And so looking around at the different parts of the world that have structures in place, it really does beg the question, what is going on in Australia that makes this such a difficult nation to come to terms with the past and repair this relationship and this kind of concept of recognition said can exist in many forms. So there is, the additional conversation in Australia, which is like, should it be treaty? Should it be voice? Having a number of different processes at the state level here around what treaty might look like. And when you do look to other parts of the world, for me as a first return to Australia, because you feel recognition here in the way in which systems disproportionately on Torres Strait Islander people. So yeah, look, I think that this weekend is our chance as a nation to that omission to actually start to build this nation towards the future where it is valuing the voices and that recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I mean, lots of people talk about the Constitution itself. It's a it was a document created in which women and Indigenous people weren't part of that process. And in fact, the intention was that the Indigenous peoples here, my people, would not exist into the future. And I think Australia is grappling with the fact that we are here and rights like other Indigenous people around the world. And the United Nations made that clear this week when it sent a strong message to Australia that to not, to basically work through this, and that Indigenous peoples have particular rights where we have the opportunities to be able to create institutions and frameworks that support our people for the process. And I think it comes back to this situation where there's one word in the No campaign that seems to have gotten traction, which is division, division. And it's like, no, communities we have, the prospects we have to grow our centering the voices of the people. And this is a unifying moment. This is a moment where we can finally about who we are, and this deep long legacy didn't begin in 1901 just actually it continued since time immemorial with First Nations peoples. And I think about the next generation legacy we leaving them, if it's one whether in which denial of the First Nations. And I worry about that, because I think citizens of Australia have an obligation to leave the nation in a better place. And it's concerning where there are arguments by the no, and if it is a no result, well, no is the stat, and that is, it's in this space.
Absolutely. So we've got time for one more question, Teela, before we wrap up. So when we wake up on October 15, what are your hopes beyond a yes vote? What should the next step be beyond that? Because yes is just part of the plan, right? We should look toward forming a formal treaty with Australia's First Nations people. Should that be our next priority?
Look, I think we have a lot to terms with and healing to do. This has very much been a very heavy moment for all Australians on whatever side of the debate they land. And I hope that we wake up with some more kindness in our heart for our differences. I hope that we can wake up and feel some love and compassion for the long connections that we have to this place, and feel a sense of purpose and a belonging. And I hope that we have the courage to keep moving forward. We've witnessed so much unfortunate, experiences of racism perpetrated against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I I don't want to live in a society that thinks it has a license to be able to just, outwardly peddle that. And I hope that, despite the outcome, we can actually see value. Like, our differences is what makes us so strong. And for example, mainstream media in Australia has done us a very good service. So if you look at just within the First Nations community, for example, we have over 250 sovereign First Nations across this continent, and that our differences are our strength. Such a more robust democracy, better decision making, and that's something to value. We continue to in this place, that we wake up and that we're not just size voice fits all, and that together, what my community might look like on Wiradjuri country different to what people might in Yolngu country or Ngarrindjeri country, and that is a gift to Australia. Like, that is a gift generations, for the fact that we had so much history to deep storytelling in this place. And so yeah, I hope that we get to write a new chapter that is a healing one for all of us.
Okay, well, that's a great point to finish this discussion. So I want to thank those of you who've listened in with us. I'm Ruth Pollard from Bloomberg, opinion based in Tokyo, and I want to thank our guest, Teela Reid, lawyer, proud Wiradjuri and Wailawan woman, who has been playing an integral part in the Uluru Statement to the Heart. Thank you very much, everyone.